Hello, my name is Gonçalo Mendonça and I'm a researcher of the Neuromuscular Research Lab at Faculdade de Motricidade Humana. Today, I'm here to talk about the role of percutaneous electrical nerve stimulation on the assessment of neuromuscular function. This talk is supposed to be short. For this reason, I will limit my speech to basic physiology while attempting to describe fundamentals of testing. Finally, I will present some examples of our research work to exemplify possible applications. I will begin by providing a general overview of the technique itself, and also I will then focus on H reflex testing, and finally I will go through nerve conduction testing. To end the discussion, I will conclude approaching the issue of measurement reliability. As a technique, percutaneous electrical nerve stimulation allows a considerable insight into individual neuromuscular function because, as can be seen in this figure, it discriminates adaptations at three different levels of the neuromuscular system. First, the supraspinal level, using, for instance, voluntary activation level or even V-wave testing. Then, at the second level, the spinal level, using H reflex testing. And finally, a third level at the muscle level, including M-wave and also muscle twitch testing. Despite its practical applications, interpretations based on this technique may be contaminated by some level of bias that we will try to explain during our presentation. Therefore, caution is advised in what concerns direct interpretations based on these measurements. The primary purpose of using this technique is to measure evoked potentials. There are two evoked potentials that can be typically recorded: the Hoffman wave, also known as the H wave, the motor wave, also known as the M wave. As can be seen in the top figure, the stimulation electrode is placed over a superficial nerve, typically the tibial nerve. The stimulation elicits the depolarization of 1A efferents that then synapse with the motor neurons at the spinal cord level. This leads to an efferent impulse that travels to the muscle and can be recorded using EMG as an evoked potential, the H reflex. The H wave is a long latency evoked potential because of the travel distance between the impulse and its occurrence. The M wave is triggered when the intensity is high enough to excite the motor axons directly. This generates an evoked potential of shorter latency because the distance between the stimulation site and the muscle is quite short. It is important to note that this technique allows measuring both the amplitude, that is size, and also the latency, that is time, of both evoked potentials. And this is important for our subsequent explanations. We will begin by examining the excitability of the H reflex. As it was said, despite measuring the excitability of the H reflex allows a considerable insight into adaptations at the spinal cord level, this measure should not be interpreted as a pure index of spinal excitability. In fact, the H reflex depends primarily on the combined effect of three mechanisms that affect its expression. First, the intrinsic properties of motor neurons, such as the membrane potential, also presynaptic inhibition caused by GABAergic interneurons that affect conductance of the 1A efferents, and also postsynaptic inhibition caused by glicergic interneurons that affect the motor neurosoma, such as it occurs with the reciprocal inhibition, for instance. As importantly, measures of H reflex excitability and subsequent interpretation should ideally be done after characterizing the full recruitment curve of the H reflex on an individual basis. Discrete measures obtained at specific current intensities can lead to profound inaccuracies because interpretations can only be done based on the ascending limb of the recruitment curve. These measurements can be taken at rest or also during sustained tonic low-level muscle contractions. There are three primary measurements that should be obtained to describe the H reflex excitability. First, the threshold of the reflex as an index of sensitivity, then the slope of the ascending limb of the recruitment curve as an index of differential excitability between the motor neurons being progressively activated by the stimulation, and finally the maximum value as an index describing the quantity of motor neurons that can be activated by this pathway. Using this technique, we recently compared the excitability of the H reflex between sexes. As can be seen on the left portion of the figure, there are considerable differences between the recruitment curve of both sexes. Females, represented here by open circles, and males, represented by closed circles, exhibit considerable differences. Males exhibit greater amplitude of the maximal H wave, as well as a steeper slope of the ascending limb of the recruitment curve. They also require less current to elicit maximal H wave amplitude. The individual and mean data of both sexes can also be seen on the right portion of the figure. Interestingly, despite this is not shown here, we also found that sex differences in H reflex excitability are largely dissipated after controlling for the effects of enhanced female antagonist-agonist coactivation as a covariate. Ultimately, this indicates that enhanced levels of muscle coactivation in females provide a partial explanation for their lower levels of H reflex excitability. Stimulation also provides a valuable insight into the integrity of nerve conduction. Besides enabling the quantification of conduction amplitude as expressed by the amplitude of the evoked potentials, it also translates the velocity of impulse traveled between the stimulation point and the muscle. Measuring the latency of the H reflex in M wave in milliseconds allows the calculation of the time difference between both waveforms, and thus to determine the time required for the impulse to travel from the point of stimulation, point S on the left of the figure, upward to the spinal cord and back again from the spinal cord to point S. This time difference is primarily affected by the velocity of nerve conduction, because the time required for the synapse between the 1A afferents in motor neurons is considerably constant. Due to its effects on the underlying tissue, blood flow restriction has been suggested to affect nerve conduction. In this study, we examined the impact of different levels of blood flow restriction on nerve conduction. Blood flow restriction was elicited by placing a tourniquet on the thigh, and measurements were taken with and without low-intensity exercise. As can be seen in the figure describing our experimental design, we tested whether 60 and 80% of blood flow restriction affected nerve conduction with and without exercise versus a no restriction condition. Our data show that at these relative intensities, blood flow restriction does not disturb nerve conduction of the sciatic nerve time without exercise, and this indicates that the magnitude of blood flow restriction typically used for training or rehabilitation purposes does not affect the integrity of the sciatic nerve, and this is quite relevant for practical purposes. Finally, as mentioned, in special circumstances, measuring the V wave, the volitional wave, unravels adaptations at the supraspinal level. The V wave is a variant of the H reflex that is evoked during maximal voluntary contractions paired by supramaximal stimulation. It reflects the level of cancellation of antidromic current resulting from volitional origin. A higher level of supraspinal drive elicits greater cancellation, thus allowing a greater magnitude of the H reflex to pass downward to be recorded as an evoked potential at the muscle level. The opposite occurs in circumstances compatible with a lower level of supraspinal drive. As it can be seen in the figures placed at the right side of the slide, with tibial nerve supramaximal stimulation performed at rest, no V wave can be detected at the muscle level. In contrast, when supramaximal stimulation is performed during maximal voluntary contraction, the V wave can be recorded in EMG. There are several limitations to this technique. For instance, to conclude that V wave adaptations arise from supraspinal centers, it is important to ensure that H reflex amplitude remains unchanged between measurements. Any change in H reflex amplitude will affect the V wave measurements independently of any adaptation at the supraspinal level. Despite these limitations, the V wave is a useful measurement that has been shown to be particularly sensitive to some physical interventions. However, its reliability, both relative and absolute, had been poorly studied. And for that reason, in 2019, we explored several approaches to V-wave analysis with the purpose of improving day-to-day reliability. As can be seen in Figure 5, maximal voluntary contractions with V-wave measurements were performed by each participant in 2 different visits to the lab. V-wave amplitude was compared between days using the mean value of the 5 versus 4 last trials versus 3 last trials versus 2 last trials. As can be seen, no between-day differences irrespectively of the approach were obtained. However, after computing reliability analysis, we observed that V-wave reliability improved after excluding the first 2 trials. This resulted in higher ICC values, that is, improved relative reliability, and also a lower standard error of the mean, that is, improved absolute reliability. In accordance, these data show that V-wave reliability is sensitive to different computational approaches, and this is relevant when comparing changes in its amplitude over time, such as those resulting from exercise training or rehabilitation. Taken together, we attempted to provide a simplified overview of this technique, and we concluded that this technique in particular allows, point 1, to discriminate between different levels of adaptation within the central nervous system, but not without limitations. Point 2, characterizing the H reflex recruitment curve is also possible. Point 3, testing the properties of nerve conduction is also possible. And finally, it allows reliable testing of the V wave when respecting certain computational procedures. Thank you.